In 2024, as the world turns its attention to ongoing conflicts like the war in Ukraine and tensions in the Middle East, a silent threat is gaining momentum on the Korean peninsula. North Korea, infamous for its provocative actions, appears to be in an advanced stage of preparation for something far more significant than mere displays of power. Recent developments in the country suggest that Pyongyang may be gearing up for military confrontation, raising new concerns in the already complex landscape of Asian geopolitics. What makes these actions particularly alarming is how they are slipping under the radar of global public attention. While the focus remains on other regions, Kim Jong-un is orchestrating significant changes in both domestic policy and the military strategy of his regime. These shifts not only deepen North Korea's isolation but also send a clear message to its neighbors and the world. The North Korean regime is prepared to abandon any pretense of peace on the Korean peninsula. The signs are hard to ignore. Constitutional changes, inflammatory speeches, and direct actions such as the destruction of peace symbols all point to a far-reaching strategic shift. Although Pyongyang's aggressive rhetoric is nothing new, the developments of 2024 seem to have crossed the usual boundaries of threats, signaling a much more serious reality. Through these actions, North Korea is positioning itself at the center of a dangerous geopolitical game, where the consequences of its decisions could ripple far beyond its borders. But what exactly has changed in North Korea's policies and strategies? That's what we'll begin to explore, starting with the radical constitutional amendments made in early 2024. In January 2024, North Korea took a drastic step by amending its constitution. In an unprecedented move, Kim Jong-un removed any reference to the peaceful reunification of the Korean peninsula, replacing it with an explicitly hostile stance towards South Korea. The new constitution not only solidifies the regime as an isolated military power, but also formalizes South Korea as its main enemy and unchanging adversary. These changes were far from symbolic. In a move that stunned even the most seasoned observers, the Arch of Reunification, a monument built in 2001 to symbolize the dream of a unified Korea, was demolished. This act represented the literal destruction of one of the last symbols of hope for reconciliation between the two countries. For many, it marked a turning point, signaling that Pyongyang is no longer interested in dialogue or negotiations. Moreover, the constitutional amendments did not happen in isolation. They were accompanied by increasingly aggressive rhetoric from Kim Jong-un, who publicly stated that these changes provide a legal foundation for military actions against South Korea. The Constitution, which was already a tool of internal political control, has now also become a diplomatic weapon, legitimizing future hostilities by the regime. This reconfiguration of North Korea's policies marks a turning point in the dynamics of the Korean peninsula. What once seemed like a geopolitical stalemate with calculated threats is rapidly evolving into something far more dangerous. Kim Jong-un's decision to remove the objective of peaceful reunification from the constitution represents a milestone that redefines North Korea's entire political strategy. This change suggests that the regime no longer sees negotiation as a viable option and is willing to take more drastic measures to achieve its goals. Experts note that Kim may be following in the footsteps of his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, who made a similar decision in 1950 when he launched the Korean War. This new policy also reflects an internal hardening of the regime. North Korea's leadership has been implementing measures that further centralize power around Kim Jong-un while promoting a narrative of national survival. For Pyongyang, South Korea is now described as a direct obstacle to the North's security and prosperity, justifying more aggressive policies both domestically and internationally. The international context also plays a significant role in this shift. With the United States and other global powers preoccupied with conflicts such as the war in Ukraine and tensions in the Middle East, North Korea seems to see a window of opportunity to push its agenda without facing significant global opposition. This perception may have accelerated the radicalization of its policies, turning military discourse into a central state strategy. North Korea's new policy is therefore not merely a response to internal or external conditions but part of a larger strategic plan. By declaring South Korea an unchanging adversary and justifying preemptive attacks, Pyongyang raises the risk of escalation on the Korean peninsula. This scenario is further reinforced by the regime's increasingly explicit threats, which we will explore in greater depth as we analyze the recent surge in rhetoric and its implications for regional stability. In February, Kim Jong-un made an official statement asserting that the recent changes to North Korea's constitution now provide the legal basis for military attacks against South Korea. This declaration was accompanied by concrete actions, such as the destruction of infrastructure symbolizing dialogue and cooperation between the two nations, a move that signified an unprecedented political and physical rupture. The demolition of structures like rail lines, communication centers, and even humanitarian facilities in the demilitarized zone goes beyond symbolism. These actions send a clear message that North Korea is willing to abandon any semblance of diplomacy. Analysts highlight that these events differ from past provocations, which often involved missile tests or military exercises without structural changes or such definitive statements. Another alarming aspect is the increasingly direct tone of North Korean leadership. Kim Jong-un publicly stated that he views South Korea as an obstacle that must be removed. This rhetoric not only heightens regional tensions but also increases pressure on South Korea's allies, such as the United States and Japan, who now face the need to recalibrate their security strategies to address Pyongyang's growing hostility. These actions and statements mark an escalation that cannot be ignored. By turning threats into state policy, North Korea is creating an environment where conflict seems increasingly plausible. However, rhetoric is just one piece of the puzzle. The military preparations accompanying these declarations suggest the regime may be gearing up for much more than its usual provocations. Since early 2024, Kim Jong-un's regime has been conducting missile tests with greater frequency, including long-range projectiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles. These displays not only showcase the country's military capabilities but also serve as direct messages to its neighbors and the United States. Another point of concern is the focus of the military exercises. Kim has ordered large-scale war simulations, including scenarios of invasions and preemptive strikes against South Korea. These drills, conducted with record-breaking troop numbers, are designed to test the readiness of North Korea's army in the event of an actual conflict. Reports also suggest that the regime is expanding its arsenal of conventional and nuclear weapons, raising alarms across the region. The military preparations extend beyond strengthening the armed forces. The regime is also mobilizing the civilian population, launching campaigns to reinforce patriotism and readiness for a potential war. Massive propaganda efforts portray South Korea as an enemy that must be defeated, while promoting the idea that individual sacrifice is essential for the nation's survival. This strategy increases the regime's control over its population, ensuring loyalty in times of crisis. These actions indicate that North Korea is preparing for much more than simple displays of power. Unlike past provocations, which were often calculated to secure diplomatic or economic concessions, the current developments point to the real possibility of conflict. To grasp the gravity of this situation, it's crucial to examine the regime's history of actions and compare them to moments that preceded past conflicts. The level of preparation and shift in rhetoric from Kim Jong-un's regime echoes the months leading up to the Korean War in 1950, initiated by his grandfather, Kim Il-sung. At that time, North Korea also adopted a stance of direct confrontation, accompanied by fiery speeches and large-scale military mobilization. There are clear parallels between the current context and that historical period. In both cases, North Korea sought to justify its actions as defensive measures against a supposedly aggressive enemy, using this as a pretext for preemptive attacks. This strategy not only mobilizes the domestic population but also confuses international perception, making it harder for other countries to respond swiftly. Another moment reminiscent of the actions in 2024 is the period from 2010 to 2017, when Pyongyang escalated nuclear weapons testing and carried out limited attacks on South Korea, such as the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island. However, unlike those localized provocations, the current actions suggest a much larger scale of planning, with an explicit focus on legitimizing open warfare through constitutional changes and aggressive symbolism, such as the destruction of peace-related structures. While history often provides clues about the future, the current situation introduces new and potentially more dangerous nuances. North Korea's military capabilities are far greater today than in past decades, including nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles. This makes historical comparisons helpful but insufficient to predict the severity of a possible conflict. The question now is how the international community, especially neighboring countries, is responding to this escalation. The recent actions by North Korea have not gone unnoticed, particularly by directly affected countries like South Korea and Japan. Both governments have intensified efforts to monitor Pyongyang's movements, conducting joint military exercises with the United States. These drills include simulations of defense against ballistic missile attacks and preparations for war scenarios on the Korean Peninsula. South Korea, in particular, has adopted a state of maximum alert. In addition to strengthening its military presence in the demilitarized zone, Seoul has invested in missile defense systems and reinforced cooperation with allies such as the United States. The South Korean president has made public statements warning of the seriousness of the situation, while seeking international support to pressure North Korea into stepping back from its aggressive actions. Japan, meanwhile, has also increased its vigilance, given the growing risk of North Korean missiles crossing its airspace. Tokyo has expanded its military capabilities, including the development of missile interception systems and the revision of its security policy, historically constrained by the country's pacifist constitution. This more proactive stance reflects rising regional tensions and the direct impact of Pyongyang's actions on Japanese security. However, outside Asia, the international response has been more limited. With powers like the United States and the European Union focused on other conflicts, such as the war in Ukraine and tensions in the Middle East, the North Korean issue has not received the attention it warrants. This lack of global focus may create an environment where Pyongyang can advance its plans without facing significant opposition. A conflict on the Korean Peninsula would be catastrophic, not just for the countries directly involved, but for the entire Northeast Asian region and potentially the world. With North Korea possessing a nuclear arsenal and long-range strike capabilities, any escalation could quickly spiral out of control, turning the peninsula into a devastating battlefield. Analysts warn that even a conventional conflict would have unprecedented human and economic impacts. The humanitarian consequences would be immense. South Korea, with its extremely high population density, especially in areas like Seoul, could face millions of civilian casualties in a short time. This is not to mention the refugees who would attempt to escape the conflict, overwhelming neighboring countries and creating a humanitarian crisis that would extend beyond Asia. Japan, located just a short distance from the peninsula, would also be directly affected, both by potential attacks and by waves of refugees and regional instability. Economically, the repercussions would be equally severe. South Korea is one of the world's largest economies and a global hub for technology and manufacturing. A conflict would disrupt vital supply chains, affecting industries such as semiconductors, which are already vulnerable due to global tensions. Japan, another economic pillar of the region, would also suffer massive losses, while China, North Korea's largest trading partner, could see its economy affected by regional collapse. Furthermore, a confrontation on the Korean Peninsula could draw major global powers into the conflict. The United States, a historical ally of South Korea, might be forced to intervene directly, while China and Russia, with strategic interests in the region, could adopt stances that heighten global tensions. This potential for international involvement turns the situation into a threat to global stability. The severity of these consequences underscores the importance of monitoring and taking preventive action against North Korea's escalation. However, with global attention divided among other conflicts and crises, the risk of underestimating the situation remains high. The reality is that North Korea's recent moves have brought the Korean peninsula to a point of extreme tension. With increasingly aggressive rhetoric and actions that suggest preparations for conflict, Kim Jong-un's regime has made it clear that it is willing to cross boundaries once thought to be untouchable. The greatest fear, however, is the risk of a nuclear attack, something that would turn the peninsula into an epicenter of destruction with impacts that would cross borders and generations. This scenario makes North Korea a unique threat, a highly militarized state, led by an isolated and unpredictable regime, but one that possesses nuclear weapons capable of striking distant targets. The prospect of escalation involving nuclear weapons makes this crisis one of the most dangerous in recent history, with the potential to destabilize not only Northeast Asia but the global balance of power. The world watches this situation with apprehension, but failing to give this threat the attention it deserves could be a fatal mistake. North Korea's next moves, and the international community's response, will determine whether we are witnessing a moment of containment or the prelude to a tragedy that will redefine the 21st century. And if you enjoyed this mini documentary here on GFlow, we've got another video about North Korea linked here on the screen. See you there.